From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast. I'm Ryan Evans. Legislation introduced in Congress last year aimed to increase the level of negotiated cash trade in U.S. cattle markets, leading the cattle industry to create a voluntary framework known as the 75% rule that aims to increase frequency and price transparency in cattle feeding and packing regions across the country. With the third quarter of the year now complete, I'm joined for an update by Elliott Dennis, assistant professor and livestock marketing economist in the Department of Agricultural Economics here at UNL. Elliott, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
And we've spoken before a couple of times about this legislation that was introduced in Congress to increase the level of negotiated cash trade in the cattle market, as I mentioned. Can you quickly just review the background on the issue and what was proposed and why?
Yeah, so there's this kind of the ongoing discussion about the level of negotiated trade, and really what that comes down to is what we call price discovery. What that means is you and I, we go to the market and we have our own expectations of what supply is going to be and what demand is going to be, and then ultimately we reach a price, and that's what we call price discovery. But there's been some concerns that these other alternative marketing arrangements, commonly lumped into a bucket called formula, they use a base price and to set their premiums and discounts, and that base price is really derived from that negotiated price. And so there's just been concerns that maybe one region is potentially bearing more of that burden than the other regions, and so part of that legislation that's really been talked about and has recently been reintroduced has been, what does that level of negotiated trade need to be by region, and how does that change over time?
So the cattle industry responded to this proposed legislation by creating the so-called 75% rule, a voluntary framework to basically regulate their own industry. Can you remind us again what the 75% rule entails? Yep.
So this policy was initiated by NCBA, and it's dubbed the 75% rule because it requires 75% of the weeks to pass 75% of the minimum trade requirement. And this minimum trade requirement was derived through a series of studies, and they came up with they call this, quote, robust amount of trade. And really that robust amount of trade, what that means is when we look at a price, we're pretty sure that that price is the true price. And so there's a lot of assumptions behind that, which we won't go into, but I'm happy to address as people have comments. But really that 75% of the weeks have to meet 75% of that robust level of trade. And this policy went into effect January 1st of 2021. And this is really the third quarter that we've completed, and really the policy says that if in 2 of 4 rolling quarters, if we have a major trigger, then NCBA would seek government action. In the first quarter of this year, didn't start off so great. There was already a major trigger, and the second quarter there was no major trigger, and then the article that I just wrote talked about the third quarter.
That's right. And listeners can find this article on what we're discussing here on our website for the Center for Ag Profitability at cap.unl.edu. And you've talked a little bit about how it's been going so far this year. And I know when we've talked about this in the past this year, after the first quarter, the second quarter, there's been some questions on if indeed this rule is going to have to trigger what it says it's going to. So first on the feeder side, the third quarter concluded at the end of September. What did the results of that quarter say about how this is going?
Yeah, so what we've seen is that the level of negotiated trade across certain regions have increased. For example, in the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region, the level of negotiated sales has increased dramatically. Important to note there that the way that this policy defines negotiated sales is negotiated cash plus negotiated grid. And when we look at specifically the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region, what we see is that the level of negotiated cash has pretty much stayed the same, but the level of negotiated grid has really increased. And so we start to see preferences across regions. This year, the way that it kind of works is we look at the 13 weeks by region, and we look at whether there was a violation of the 75% level of robust trade. And what we saw is that Nebraska-Colorado region violated twice. The Texas-Oklahoma region violated once, one of the weeks, and the Kansas, Iowa, and Minnesota regions did not violate any of the weeks. And important to note there that the Nebraska-Colorado region, one of the primary reasons why it was violating was that Colorado, during the third quarter of 2021, didn't report levels of negotiated cash sales for cattle once, and that's primarily because they did not couldn't meet confidentiality requirements. And so this whole idea about these AMS marketing regions is really drawing kind of that to the forefront as well. And so it didn't the number of violating weeks wasn't enough to trigger a minor trigger, and so once again the industry kind of moves forward.
And how about on the side of packer participation in the plan?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So there's two portions of the plan. There's the feedlot participation or the cattle feeding region participation, and then there's the packing participation. There still is no information about the packing region or packing participation right now that's been publicly available. And I've had conversations with other people. They say that some of that analysis is being done, but it's not being publicly reported. And so I think they're monitoring it, but technically the plan isn't complete without the packer participation. So it really takes the idea is to really require both feedlot participation and packer participation, recognizing that packers are responsible for purchasing cattle at a certain way, and also recognizing that feedlots have to be willing to sell cattle a certain way.
Back in March this year, our senator here in Nebraska, Deb Fischer, along with Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, introduced the bipartisan Cattle Market Transparency Act, legislation that would restore transparency and accountability in the cattle market. It would seek to establish regional cash minimums and equip producers with more market information. How does this proposed legislation relate to what we're talking about here with negotiated trade, and how does a 75% rule potentially fit in with this?
Yeah, so that Cattle Transparency and Markets Act, that was the bipartisan legislation that was introduced, has a lot in there that is not related to the NCBA rule, such as the cattle contract library, correctly reporting or timely reporting of carcass weights, and really the thing that directly relates to it is these regional minimums that would be set by the chief economist at USDA. And what their regional minimums, what that compares was that they'd look at over the last 18 months, what would be that regional minimum, and that would be what would be required for that region to obtain for that the coming weeks. And then what would happen is to make sure that one region is not unduly bearing the burden, what they say is that the minimum, or the person who's the lowest, that kind of becomes the minimum bar, and everyone cannot be required to be 3 times as high as that. So for instance, if let's say Texas, Oklahoma was the minimum, and they were at 10,000 head per week on negotiated cash, what that would mean is that Nebraska would not be required to sell more than 30,000 head of negotiated cash or cattle on the negotiated cash. And so that's what is currently proposed. There's a lot of discussion about this. There seems to be an urgency to get something done before next year. And so I think right now we're just kind of a wait and see, but that's the thing that relates most from the bill to what NCBA has proposed.
Okay, great. Thank you. And back to the 75% rule that, as you said, industry is moving ahead in that framework for now. Almost a year in, how do you think that's going to the 75% rule? How is that doing to address these concerns about negotiated trade?
I think it has, when we look at the numbers, it has raised the level of negotiated cash. And once again, we're defining it as negotiated cash plus, or negotiated sales is defined as negotiated cash plus negotiated grid. I think it has done some benefit to raise that. In fact, when we look at over the last really 10 years, and we look at maybe an 18-month rolling average, the level of negotiated sales in the Texas-Oklahoma region has really been close to the highest it's ever been in those 18-month rolling windows. So I think it's making good strides in that, and I think it's accomplishing some of what the industry is wanting, which is higher levels of negotiated cash. Now, underlying all of this discussion is whether that's going to have some impact on price discovery or how accurate prices are. And I don't think we have enough information yet to determine whether it's accomplished that goal.
All right, that's Dr. Elliott Dennis, assistant professor and livestock marketing economist in the Agricultural Economics Department here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And you can find a new article on this topic we've been discussing here on this episode, along with past articles that looked at results from previous quarters under the 75% rule framework on our website for the Center for Ag Profitability at cap.unl.edu. Elliott, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.